It's Wednesday, the 7th of September, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Mark Harper, Labour MP Angela Eagle, New Statesman senior correspondent Harry Lambert and Daily Telegraph associate editor Camilla Tominey. Today, new Prime Minister Liz Truss has been here in Downing Street this morning holding the first meeting of her new cabinet. These are some of the ministers who were there, all supporters of her leadership campaign. So far, no room for supporters of Rishi Sunak. This was her opening pitch to the nation.
We have huge reserves of talent, of energy and determination. I am confident that together we can ride out the storm.
We'll bring you all the latest as she continues to form her government. And she's about to face Keir Starmer and her first Prime Minister's questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. So, Liz Truss's first full day in the new job. Let's just show you some of the front pages and the line they took away from her speech on the steps of Downing Street yesterday. The Daily Telegraph, with the headline, "We can ride out the storm." Similarly, in the Mail, "Together we can ride out the storm." The Guardian, slightly different, "Into the storm. Truss vows to solve cost of living crisis." And the Financial Times, "Truss assumes office with vow to steer Britain out of energy storm." But you get the idea. Memorable lines from other speeches from former Prime Ministers. You may remember Theresa May's tackling the burning injustices. Francis of Assisi was quoted by Margaret Thatcher. The question to the panel is, how will Liz Truss's speech be remembered?
Well, look, I think that top line, riding out the storm, and the three focuses she set out, the economy and the energy crisis and the NHS, I think it'll be on how well she delivers against those. And she made a big point, both in her speech yesterday, but also in her leadership acceptance speech on Monday, about delivery and how important that is. So I think she'll be judged on that. And of course, you know, we'll see as early as tomorrow what the government's going to do to help people with the energy price crisis. So I think it'll be judged on how well she delivers, as most Prime Ministers are.
All right, before I get your response, Angela, let's just take a look at the scene in Downing Street. The weather not helping Liz Truss again, a little like yesterday as she arrived. We're expecting her to leave shortly, actually, and make her way to the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, for her first Prime Minister's questions. We'll keep an eye on the big black door to see when she actually steps outside. Was it memorable, what she said yesterday? Will you remember it? How will you remember it, Angela?
Well, I think it was a series of cliches which were fairly meaningless, so we'll have to wait and see what she actually delivers. Remember, we've had stasis over the summer while people have been worrying about how they're going to deal with the energy crisis and feed their kids and heat their homes this winter in the face of these huge spiralling bills. Our ex-Prime Minister was holidaying and nursing his bruised ego, and she was busy trying to appeal to a tiny sliver of the British people.
Well, I suppose those are the rules, aren't they?
81,000 people elected her. That's less than a constituency's worth of voters when we've got 650 voters. And she got less than 50% of the Tory membership. So she's got a very narrow mandate, less than half, even within her own party. No mandate from the country. So I think my view is we'll be there with our arms crossed, waiting to see what she comes up with.
Harry, for you, the words there, her first speech on the steps of Downing Street, the steps of Number 10. How will it be remembered, if at all?
I don't think it will be remembered fondly by anyone who was listening. I thought it was remarkably unmemorable, her language. There was nothing like the Theresa May burning injustices. That speech in 2017 was also interesting because May outlined a whole series of ways in which the country was unjust. Truss really said nothing of consequence apart from, I think, one thing, which is that she wants to both invest in the country and cut taxes. And I think that was the key point behind the platitudes and inanities And I think it's the wrong way to go, because we're going to cut taxes while also needing a lot of revenue. And there are shoulders that can bear the burden, and we could be raising taxes, in my view.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about the priorities throughout the programme. Camilla, for you, what she said, did it live up to expectations or not?
I mean, I think it was underwhelming, but maybe that was fitting of the occasion, because Boris Johnson had spoken earlier in the day and he was criticised for being too boosterish and almost in denial of the problems that the country's facing. And I think the intention is not necessarily to be liked, but if she's trying to emulate Thatcher, to be respected and to have a clear vision, ideologically and from a policy point of view, of what she wants to deliver, rather than this sort of sense of indecisiveness and this sense that actually Johnson was associated with his own popularity more than actual valid policy decisions. So I think that was the presentation, wasn't it? Look, it's not particularly fancy. She said herself, I'm not a slick performer, but this is what I intend to do, and I'm going to expedite the process
Well,
this
which
week.
is why her first Prime Minister's questions will be interesting, of course, up against Keir Starmer. Mark, you mentioned the 3 distinct priorities. Let's have a listen to what she said.
As Prime Minister, I will pursue 3 early priorities. Firstly, I will get Britain working again. I have a bold plan to grow the economy through tax cuts and reform. Secondly, I will deal hands-on with the energy crisis caused by Putin's war. I will take action this week to deal with energy bills and to secure our future energy supply. Thirdly, I will make sure that people can get doctor's appointments and the NHS services they need.
So those distinct priorities we will discuss, as I said, throughout the programme. But first of all, let's have a look at the first Cabinet meeting. Pictures, as usual, have been sent out. There they are, all those smiling faces, as you'd expect on day one, gathered round. A lot of her allies and contemporaries there. But you will also notice that there has been something of a clear-out of Rishi Sunak supporters. A unity Cabinet it is not, Mark. Is that a problem?
Well, look, there's not a single person who backed Rishi Sunak as a member of the Cabinet. So she's obviously decided her government's priority is delivery, and she's obviously decided that she wants the most prominent Rishi Sunak supporters to be on the backbenches and help her do the delivery by holding her ministers to account to make sure they deliver on the promises.
I see. So you're going to hold her feet to the fire?
Well, look, that's our job as MPs, is to hold ministers to account. And, you know, I did that during the COVID pandemic when, frankly, the Leader of the Opposition was absent without leave and didn't hold the government to account. But it's important in government that ministers come to Parliament, respect Parliament, know that there are people that are going to be holding them to account, and that's what raises the quality of delivery.
What will you be watching out particularly? What are you ready to go on the attack over?
No, I'm going to be very supportive. I mean, I think the most important thing is the issue on energy prices. I mean, I spent the entire summer arguing, as part of Rishi's campaign, that we needed a big plan to help particularly those on the lowest incomes and the most vulnerable, to help with energy prices through the winter. So I'm actually very pleased that the new Prime Minister is going to set out a large, big plan tomorrow to help those people. And obviously the devil will be in the detail. Well,
it will indeed. And before we get onto that, Angela, I know you're keen to talk about it, and we will. Let's just show our viewers some of the people who've taken up the new Cabinet jobs. None of it, actually, certainly at the top, is a surprise, particularly because we knew. But Kwasi Kwarteng there, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Suella Braverman, Home Secretary. James Cleverly is Foreign Secretary. Therese Coffey, close friend of Liz Truss, is Health Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister. And Ben Wallace stays as Defence Secretary. We can show you some more of the posts. Jacob Rees-Mogg is now the Secretary of State for Business. Kemi Badenoch, who also was a leadership contender, is Trade Secretary. Kit Malthouse, close to Boris Johnson, Education Secretary. And Anne-Marie Trevelyan is Transport Secretary. Big beasts on the back benches. And as you heard there, they'll be raising the quality of government. Actually, I will, just before I can, I forgot about these who are leaving. Priti Patel and Nadine Dorries decided to leave the fray. Dominic Raab, Steve Barclay, Grant Shapps and George Eustace have all left the Cabinet. How big a problem is that going to be?
When you talk about big beasts as well, not just former Cabinet Ministers, but also the likes of some of the grey hairs. You've got David Davis and IDS kind of on the back benches who may well be critical of government. There's now a fight going on, I think, for some of the chairmanship of some of the select committees because they're also influential posts. It depends whether Tory MPs like Mark and others and Rishi Sunak supporters are going to follow Boris Johnson's advice and back Liz all the way, or whether there's going to be dissent. But I think that surely Tories understand the urgency with which the government must come up with a rescue package for the cost of living crisis that's actually going to give them a hope of winning the next general election. More infighting is not going to help the Tory cause at all.
No, look, I'm very clear. I want this government to be successful. We've got 2 years maximum before the next general election. And I think MPs are always wise to remember that we ultimately work for the voters. We work for our constituents. And I will judge everything the government does on, is it helping the people that elect me to Parliament? You know, that's my job as a Member of Parliament. It's the job of every Member of Parliament. And I desperately want this government to be successful. This
is a cabinet of Liz's lackeys. It's not a cabinet that looks widely across even the Tory party, an argument that Mark was making in the newspapers not long ago, that there had to be a much more wide-ranging representation of views in the Tory party in the cabinet. That has not
But Coffey
happened.
is quite left-leaning, isn't she?
Hang on.
She's not on the right of the party, the deputy PM.
No, she's a personal friend of Liz Truss,
But her politics
as we know.
are different.
But let me just finish. What we've also got is a Prime Minister that said she wants to get Britain working again. Well, who's been in power for the last 12 years? She wants to allow people to get to see their GPs. Well, who has been in power for the last 12 years? She wants to deal with the energy crisis. They've done nothing about it while they've been gazing at their navels and fighting each other. We are on the fourth Tory leader in the last 6 years. The Tory party's turned into a sort of speed dating agency for creating prime ministers every couple of years. They're not fit to govern. Let's have a general election.
Mark?
Well, look, that's what I would expect Angela to say. But look, I think we should focus on... Look, we obviously had an interregnum during the summer while we were resolving the leadership process. But we did say that we would deal with that as soon as we had a new Prime Minister. And if Liz Truss, as she said, sets out a large package of support for people tomorrow, I think that's what voters will care about. And if the package of support is announced tomorrow to take effect before the price cap in October, and I think most people will go, actually, we're really pleased that the government's taking action. That's what they'll care about, is delivery.
Isn't that a problem for Labour, is that actually some senior Tories I spoke to yesterday think, you know, it's only 2 years, 18 months, 2 years to the next election. They are going to focus on that, and they think the delivery of a big energy package is going to take them there, despite Angela's legitimate point that actually it is the Tories that have been in power since 2010.
Well, remarkably, the next election doesn't actually need to be held until January 2025. And there is a lot of time for the current government to get through the crisis, and I think beyond the upswing. But I just want to give Liz Truss some credit for her appointments, not because I agree with them, but because I think if you think about things in her perspective, you know, she has the threat of someone like Kebby Badenoch, who she's given the international trade job to, instead of putting her in education where she could be more prominent. And I think that's good politics for Liz Truss's survival. She's given James Cleverly the Foreign Office, who was her former minister, which I think is good politics if Liz Truss wants to dominate the international stage. I think Truss constantly does things which are good for Truss. I just don't think they're very good for the country.
Right. I mean, Andrew, it's also a very diverse cabinet in terms of politicians fulfilling the top roles, coming from an ethnic minority background, and also several prominent women in those positions, things that Labour could only dream of.
It's diverse in some ways, which I will acknowledge and congratulate them on, but it's not diverse in others. 23 of the cabinet members are public school educated, only 3 from grammar schools and 5 from comprehensives. This is a cabinet of people who are public school educated, very, very well off, who don't really understand the trials and tribulations of everyday people.
But there's one more interesting thing, if I can, about the cabinet, which is in many ways it's the most right-wing cabinet we've seen in a long time. However, they're about
But are they going to follow through with that ideology?
But well, as one Tory was saying to me yesterday, the irony is that they're about to push through one of the most left-wing policies imaginable with this freezing of energy bills. It's a bit like the Johnson government, where you had Sunak, who was theoretically right-wing, but he was doing lots of left-wing things.
Also, Liz Truss is hardly associated with the sort of Bullingdon boy network. I mean, she's brought up in Yorkshire. I mean, I think a fairly middle-income family. She went to a state school.
Boris Johnson's cabinet had 66%
is it not good
of public
to have a Prime Minister's also a
educated
Northerner?
people.
I mean, it's good to have a Prime Minister that's a Northerner. There's quite a lot of Northerners in this cabinet.
Yeah, but Camilla, what about Harry's point that actually they are, a lot of the members of the cabinet, ideologically on the right, certainly
on the extreme
historically,
right,
well, you would say the extreme right, but on the right. But are we going to see far more Labour-style policies when it comes to the big questions on energy?
Well, economically out of necessity because of the era that she's in. You could even argue that she might be the right Prime Minister for the wrong time in that respect, simply because, as Harry's pointed out, this is going to have to be the Tory party that once again produces the magic money tree that Theresa May derided.
This is a woman who actually said that giving tax cuts that went mainly to the rich and didn't help those who are really struggling was fair. She said that this weekend on Laura Goonsberg's show. But look, that is a very peculiar view of the world that we have to live in if we're going to create a fairer, more socially sustainable society.
I mean, is that fair?
Well, look, I don't know what's going to get announced tomorrow in terms of the energy price
I think
crisis,
we have a fairly good
but
idea.
we've seen stuff that's briefed out. But look, it's a bit like during the pandemic. There is a crisis facing the country, and what people want in those circumstances is the government to take action in the same way Rishi Sunak rolled out a fantastic package which supported people, kept businesses afloat. Liz Truss looks like she's going to roll out a similar size package tomorrow to make sure that we can get consumers and businesses through this energy price crisis. I think that's what the public want. They want government to look at the reality in front of them, put ideology to one side, and deal with the problem in front of them, but be totally focused on reality.
On ideology, you've got Truss, as Angela says, scrapping the national insurance levy. That's going to save the poorest 10% in society £8. It will save the richest 10% £1,800. The richest 10% won't even notice that they've saved £1,800.
All right.
She said that's fair.
Right, we're going to
my definition.
We can talk about her quote on redistribution in just a moment. We also mentioned Therese Coffey, the new Health Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister and friend of Liz Truss. Let's listen to what she had to say.
I'm just about to go into the department and to go and meet our great civil servants I'm going to work with. We've got priorities A, B, C, D, ambulances, backlogged care, D, doctors and dentists, and we're going to work through that, and we'll make sure that we are delivering for patients.
You've written about her, Camilla. I mean, most people, I would say, at home won't know who Therese Coffey is.
She's not a household name at all.
No, she really isn't. How did she get here? Tell us about her.
Well, basically, I think she befriended Liz Truss in kind of the post-student politics days when they joined the Conservative Party. So Liz Truss defected from the Lib Dems, famously. They built up a friendship, and then they both got elected in 2010, so they're the same intake, and also on nearly neighbouring seats in rural Suffolk. Actually, they've been described as a bit of a yin and yang.
Just to say, Liz Truss leaving there, I think there's been a brief pause in the rain. In she goes, and she's off to the House of Commons. And, of course, we will be picking her up there when she goes to the dispatch box for her first Prime Minister's questions. A
bit of a yin and yang, simply because there's this sense that, and Mark can fill in the gaps on this, Therese is very much a kind of social convener. She's a moderate. She brings different aspects of the party together. Liz is more of a kind of loner, a single operator. Therese's politics is more on the left of the party, whereas Liz's is on the right. But actually, that's quite a formidable combination. She's also a details woman, got a PhD in chemistry. Apparently, she goes through government briefs, tears them up, writes them again. Very, very focused on the detail, whereas I think there's a sense that Truss is a bit more broad brush. So actually, maybe those two opposites attracting is a formidable combination for number 10. We'll have to wait and see.
Were you surprised?
No, not at all. But I think actually, for me, I'm actually very pleased with that appointment because I worked in the Department for Work and Pensions as a minister, and Therese has been the Secretary of State there. And I think what's remarkable over the last few years during the pandemic, we saw an enormous number of people had to move on to universal credit, use the welfare system, many for the first time, and it all worked. And it wasn't a story. And I think that's because she worked incredibly hard in the department and made sure it could deal with that huge crisis. So if she brings some of that focus on detail and delivery to the Department of Health, the National Health Service, and, importantly, social care, then I think that will prove to be a really good appointment. I
mean, in terms of you saying it wasn't a story, there may be something in wanting to keep quiet in terms of a media profile. Might be happier to put someone like Therese Coffey up in front of the cameras and talking to the newspapers than others.
Yeah, well, than others in Johnson's cabinet, certainly. I think Therese Coffey and Liz Truss are both people who will show a level of focus and work internally that someone like our former PM did not. The big question...
That's a very low bar.
The big question is, what happens next with this cabinet? I think it's all about what Kwasi Kwarteng does in the Chancellor role. I think that's a more important point than what Therese Coffey does at Health at the moment.
And Deputy Prime Minister, which to some extent is
it's sort of team mascot.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, we're going to talk to the SNP, Stephen Flynn, in just a moment, because First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, hello to you, Stephen, we'll be with you in a second. Nicola Sturgeon congratulated, unsurprisingly, Liz Truss on her appointment, but she was also busy unveiling her programme for government, aiming to tackle the issue of the rising cost of living. She's called it a humanitarian crisis. Let's listen to one of her proposals.
I can announce that we will shortly introduce emergency legislation to Parliament. The legislation will include measures to deliver a rent freeze. The Scottish Government does not have the power to stop your energy bill soaring, but we can and will take action to ensure that your rent does not rise.
Stephen Flynn, there's already a shortage of properties. Won't this rent freeze just push more landlords out of the sector? That's certainly the fear of some within the sector, making the shortage worse and ultimately pushing up the price of rents when the freeze ends.
I think what the rent freeze will do and what it's being put in place to do is to protect people who are struggling at this moment in time from the fact that we have a cost of living crisis. Now, we're all well aware of the fact that energy bills are now going to be frozen at 40% more than what they are, indeed double actually what they were last summer, but that doesn't end things there. Inflation's still at a 40-year high, interest rates are at a 30-year high, got the slowest economy in the entire G20 bar Russia, wages are at a 20-year low, so action needs to be taken. The Scottish Government has limited levers at its disposal, but where it has the ability to elicit change, it has done so, and it did so yesterday by announcing not just a rent freeze, but a moratorium on evictions, a rail freeze, and of course the child payment, the Scottish child payment, which could help up to 400,000 children in Scotland receive £25 a week. These are huge policy announcements, which will recognise the scale of the crisis, something which the UK government's been slow to do.
Right, you say they're huge, but actually, as I understand it, your rent freeze is going to end at the end of March next year. I mean, things may not have changed that dramatically. What will happen then?
Well, I would assume, as you would expect, that the government will look at it in the run-up to that, and of course that will be in and around budget time, which would make sense. But I think we need to look at the wider package.
So you could extend it for a lot longer?
You would anticipate, if we're still in the situation that we are in, that the government will certainly take that into consideration. I'm sure that that's something that has probably already been said of it, and if it hasn't, I would assume it would be. But the reality is that the government in Scotland has limited levers.
Right.
Limited levers, but the ones that they do have, they've used, and they've used them extensively yesterday, and that's something that we should all welcome. And certainly I think in terms of the rent freeze, it's something which I've seen Sadiq Khan just yesterday wanting the powers to replicate that for London. So it's obviously got broad support across the political spectrum.
Right, but have you used all the levers at your disposal? Because actually, last year, in terms of help with the cost of living, you announced free school meals for all primary school-aged children. It was in your last year's programme for government. It hasn't happened. Why not?
Well, there's obviously a policy in place there, than one that will be delivered upon. But yes, we do, of course.
Well, hang on, it hasn't been delivered. It hasn't been delivered. You do accept that that is a broken promise from last year.
Joe, as I said, it will be delivered upon. But when you're talking about levers of power, let's not forget that the Scottish Government spends in excess of £600 million a year just mitigating policies from Westminster. So the likes of the bedroom tax and so on and so forth don't apply in Scotland, because the Scottish Government uses the powers that it has to protect people in Scotland. And that's what the First Minister chose to do yesterday, to use the powers that we have in relation to rents, in relation to rail fares, to protect the public.
I hear you, but can you tell me when that policy that you promised, it was supposed to start in August, when will it be delivered?
At this moment in time, I can't give a specific date in relation to that, Joe, but what I can give a specific date on, and I'm sure it's something that you and indeed the rest of the panellists will welcome, is the fact that the Scottish child payment in November will increase to £25 per week, something which, of course, doesn't exist anywhere else in Scotland, and which will help to alleviate 400,000 children living in poverty.
That is one of your central policies, but I'm interested that if you are making a programme for government, and I know you'd be holding the Westminster government to account in terms of what they are pledging to do, that you can't tell families, parents, when this policy will be delivered. I mean, might it not be until nearer Christmas?
And of course, the same families and parents who will be listening to the fact that the Scottish Government have just delivered, or will be delivering in November, £25 a week into their pocket to help them with the cost of living crisis, something which the UK Government is not doing. That's a huge policy announcement, and it's something that I think we need to reflect on a little bit more detail. 400,000 children in Scotland are going to benefit from the Scottish Child Payment, something which is should be, and rightly will, receive acclaim right across these aisles. Now, what we should be arguing for is the UK Government to copy that. And I say to those families in Scotland who are struggling that where the Scottish Government can help, they are helping. But ultimately, the key levers of power still sit with Westminster. And I think that's something that we can all acknowledge.
Can I just talk to you about Nicola Sturgeon's description of the cost of living crisis? Because describing it as a humanitarian crisis, I think in a lot of people's minds would conjure up the image of war, famine, natural disasters. Was it too hyperbolic, do you think?
No. As I said earlier, the cost of living crisis is having a huge impact upon people. We know that inflation is at a 40-year high. We know that inflation, interest rates are at a 30-year high. We know that wages are at a 20-year low. And of course, we know that the UK Government is now going to freeze energy prices at double what they already were.
Yes.
That is going to have a huge impact upon family budgets. You know, I as a member of Parliament, I'm sure Angela and Mark received the same communications from members of the public who are in extremely difficult circumstances.
Well,
and the
let
UK
me bring
Government's
them
been
in.
slow to act.
Yeah, well, let me bring them in response. Is that the right way to describe what we are now experiencing or about to experience, a humanitarian crisis?
Well, I wouldn't choose to describe it like that, but it is very serious for families. And, you know, I've had constituents writing to me about that, which is exactly why the government's made it a very top priority to deal with the energy price thing, which we're expecting to see tomorrow, which is on the Prime Minister's third day in office. So I think that's pretty good, actually, in terms of pace. It's a big announcement, and it's going to take place in the first week.
We have had, of course, a long, hot summer in those terms, but obviously that was the leadership contest. What about the term humanitarian crisis? Is that what we are experiencing?
I understand what she means. Many people are now very desperate. We've got a fall in real-term value of wages. We've got huge increases in inflation, particularly for goods that are necessities. We have for food, for heating. We've got many people who were struggling on the edge of being able to cope before this happened, and we've also got a situation in which the costs of living are spiralling out of control. In my constituency, we have food banks never busier, now collecting hot water bottles, collecting blankets, trying to source pay-as-you-go tokens so that they can try to do their best to help people get through the winter. And I don't think that some people who don't see that going on have any idea how desperate people are.
In terms of the relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Liz Truss, how do you think they're going to get on, Camilla?
As well as Nicola Sturgeon gets on with any Tory Prime Minister. I mean, obviously Truss isn't as divisive as Boris Johnson was up in Scotland. I think Truss will consider this policy about freezing private and public rents as sort of Corbynomics on steroids, and will make the argument, like Liz Truss has attacked the idea of a windfall tax as disincentivising investment in Scotland. We've already heard from landlords associations saying, well, people just won't put their properties on the rental market because if they don't know that they're going to get their rents in. Also, it plays into this stereotype that all landlords are some sort of fat cats going around with multiple properties and don't have their own bills to pay and aren't affected by this crisis themselves. So,
right. Stephen, you're shaking your head. I'll come to you in a moment, Harry. Stephen?
Yes, I think in terms of the relationship between the First Minister and Liz Truss, I think Liz Truss firstly embarrassed herself over the summer with some of the language that she used, but ultimately she doesn't just need to respect Nicola Sturgeon, she needs to respect the democratic view of the people of Scotland who've delivered the Scottish Government and delivered the Scottish Government with a mandate to hold that second independence referendum. Now, if Liz Truss, as I say, doesn't want to respect the First Minister, she must respect the will of the people of Scotland, and if she doesn't, then I would hazard a guess that she'll continue to lose in Scotland.
Well, you're obviously referencing what Liz Truss said during the campaign about ignoring the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. But Nicola Sturgeon also said that Liz Truss would be a disaster for the UK. If she governs how she has campaigned over the summer, she will be a disaster, not just for Scotland, but for all of the UK. Does that show the same sort of respect that you are expecting from Liz Truss?
I'm afraid to say I think that's true. And if you just look at the announcements of our cabinet in the last day or so, it kind of reflects that. You know, we've got a Chancellor who said that UK workers are lazy. We've got a Home Secretary who doesn't respect human rights. We have a Secretary of State for Energy who's a climate denier, and now we have a Secretary of State for Northern Ireland who appears, as I understand it, to be a massive Brexiteer, and yet he's the one who's going to have to negotiate a solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Of course, Liz Truss is going to be a disaster for the UK, but more importantly, she's going to be a disaster for the people of Scotland, people who did not elect her and who have not elected the Tories since 1955.
How's it going to go?
Well, look, that's a very nationalist view of the world. I think, look, there's always going to be a tension here. The fact is Scotland has two governments. It has a UK government and it has a devolved government, and they have to work together. And yes, when they're from opposing parties, that's challenging.
Well, was it wise of Liz Truss to say that during the campaign?
I'm sure the two of them, the Prime Minister and the First Minister, I'm sure, are going to have a good working relationship. Is there going to be political tension? Of course there is, but that is the nature of politics, and it'll be resolved, you know, by the electors.
I think it's very productive that we have the Scottish Government showing another way, and I think it's very strange to oppose the rent freeze, when we're seeing public sector wages being frozen. I think it's also, it is a crisis. Half the population, the bottom half of the income distribution, don't have any savings. They can't withstand these kinds of shifts in the cost of living. And to go back to Angela's point, you know, I definitely don't want to sing from the Labour hymn sheet here, but the people in the cabinet who are publicly educated, who are from a certain way of seeing the world, just may not appreciate that. And I think the Scottish rent freeze is appropriate, and I think more could be being done by Truss to help with the situation. But the key thing to do that, unless you want borrowing costs to spiral, and they're now 87 billion a year, the debt interest payments,
because of the bond markets and the pound sinking, because the international markets are so worried about Liz Truss's economics.
You've got to raise taxes where you can, and I think the big place to do that is on wealth.
All right, we're going to talk about that pretty well now, but I'm going to say goodbye to Stephen Flynn. Thank you very much for joining us today from the SNP. I'll show you this headline in The Times. It is, of course, the #1 issue. The headline says, freezing energy bills set to cost taxpayers £150 billion. It's gone up, actually, just this week, from sort of £90 billion to 100 to 130 to 150 billion pounds. I'll tell you what we think we know, Camilla, what we're expecting tomorrow, and you can give us your view. But it does look now as if, despite what Liz Truss said during the campaign, that her government is going to go ahead and freeze annual average household energy bills at around £2,500 a year. Businesses will be helped too. We don't know exactly the mechanism. It's going to be funded through government borrowing rather than, as we had initially thought, through higher bills over 10 or 20 years. What do you make of her strategy?
Well, it's nothing surprising because we've heard this strategy being hinted throughout the whole leadership campaign. Economically, the approach is going to be, of course, to give people immediate relief. It's going to be a pandemic-sized package because we're in that kind of situation, a cost of living crisis. You know, comparisons might be made. Angela wants to argue it's all of the Conservatives making, but then Gordon Brown often referred to the global financial crisis, and there are global issues.
It was a global financial crisis.
I think a global issue would be that Russia has invaded Ukraine and pushed energy prices up, so it's not just a Tory invention. But also there's this sense of how do the Tories unite this kind of a unique electoral caucus, which are red wall voters and the kind of blue rinse brigades of yesteryear in the home counties. And that is surely by A, providing the packages where needed, but also by lowering tax, because people want to have more money in their pocket at the end of the month. And and equally, I take your point entirely, Harry, about taxing the wealthy more. But equally, she's talking about a growth economy, and a growth economy depends on competitive tax rates for bigger businesses to increase investment in this country and create more jobs and therefore create more wealth. I mean, it's classic Thatcherism.
Yeah, it is. And for 40 years, we've seen no good evidence that tax cuts for the rich will lead to growth for the economy. And that's for that's a very good reason for that. It's a very good reason for that. If you give money to the rich, they're much more likely to save it than if you give it to those on lower incomes. So the benefits for the economy of tax cuts for the rich are just so starkly unproven. It's amazing that we are in this debate once again.
Characterise it as tax cuts for the rich and not tax cuts for everyone, even though
the national
obviously
insurance cut is a tax cut for the rich because only £8
But the national insurance, the levy itself was most punitive towards workers, and not just workers, but also employers. So you had employers who are going to get taxed more personally and have to take more out of wages of their employees, therefore pushing wages down, not up. I don't get this economic argument. Do you want wages to go up?
Let Harry
or down?
respond.
Well, it's just we know the distributional effect of the national insurance cut. We saw it on Sunday on the Laura Kuenssberg show. Liz Truss is aware of the effect of this policy. It's going to give a lot more money to the richer 10% of the population. It's give nothing to the poorest 10% of the population.
Who don't
Right,
pay.
and I'm going to just pause you for a moment because we're just about reaching the time on Politics Live ahead of Prime Minister's questions to welcome viewers from BBC News Channel. Welcome to you. We are starting to discuss the #1 policy that we are expecting to be announced by Prime Minister Liz Truss, or her government certainly, tomorrow, and that is about a package of support for households and businesses on energy bills. We have PMQ'S coming up in about 10 minutes' time. Let's talk to Dr Linda Yu, Oxford University economist and author. You were listening, hello to you, Linda. You were listening to the discussion there. She is going to borrow a significant amount of money, Prime Minister Liz Truss, to pay for this energy plan. Around £150 billion is reported. Will it deliver?
I think it's going to have to deliver because this is a real crisis. And so that sum is obviously huge. That's probably, that rivals, if not exceeds, what was spent on the pandemic to support businesses and households during the lockdown. And I think if we look at the scale of the energy crisis, it is of similar magnitude. There's going to be a lot of people who just won't be able to afford to pay their energy bills. So what I would say is that's a huge amount of borrowing, but because it is a global crisis, just like the pandemic was, you see similar measures being taken by the European Union. Brussels is proposing also to freeze wholesale energy prices, and that's also going to cost member countries a huge amount. So anytime governments are under pressure and you're worried that creditors, bond investors might say, oh, wait, hang on, it's better to be part of the herd. In other words, you know, all countries are in the same position. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. And will it deliver? I think, as I say, implementation is going to be absolutely key, just making sure that not only are wholesale prices being frozen, but to use that money to help those who most need it to pay their energy bills come this winter.
So broadly, you would agree with what the Chancellor has been saying, even though it breaks with sort of Conservative consensus and orthodoxy, that there is capacity in the UK economy, for the reasons you've said, to borrow that sum of money, whatever impact it might have in the future?
I think this is where all countries being in the same position would help. So what we saw in the last 2 years is that debt to GDP ratios exceeded national output for the whole year. And this wasn't just for the UK. This was across advanced economies. This is also a global energy crisis. And I think in that sense, so long as the policy does deliver, does help cushion the recession which is coming. And it'll also bring down inflation because you're freezing wholesale energy prices. So instead of inflation, you know, running upwards higher into the double digits, this is actually going to bring down inflation a bit faster. I think so long as it's a plan that does these targeted things, it wouldn't look out of step to how other advanced economies are also beginning to look at this issue. And that's key for borrowing capacity.
I'm just going to get some reaction, Linda, to what you said, but obviously stay with us. We were talking earlier, Angela, you were on the committee talking to the Bank of England governor. What do you make of what Linda said, that actually it might help bring down inflation slightly rather than inflame it?
Well, she's right. That's why Labour suggested it months and months and months ago. And she's right. If we stay within the herd, it's less likely to be a problem for the pound. But I think what's causing a problem for the pound at the moment is Liz Truss's economic pronouncements about unfunded tax cuts for the rich on top of the borrowing that's going to be made here. That's what's caused a wobble in the markets. That's the fact is we've got higher rates of inflation than the rest of the G7. And if you look at the Bank of England's forecast and you look at other more independent forecasts, some are forecasting inflation to go up as high as 20%. So we are an outlier because our inflation is worse than the G7.
But what about those national insurance rises? Because you didn't want those either, did you?
No, they were the wrong tax at the wrong time. That doesn't mean to say at some time in the future you might be able to do it. That's why we were against them when Rishi Sunak brought them in. Because
but you're also against cutting them now?
Well, I mean, it's different now. Because what you then do is you give the money back to the top few percent, and you don't give that money.
For them at the time,
it's the opportunity cost of what you do with the 29 billion cost of cutting that national insurance now, you could help people who are more vulnerable now more effectively, like, for example, in reintroducing the £20 of universal credit, which goes directly to people who are really suffering. So it's not that we're against, from that point of view, it's what else could you do with that money rather than cut that particular tax at that particular time.
I'm just going to show everybody inside the chamber, inside the House of Commons chamber, because, it's filling up nicely, as you would expect, of course, for the first Prime Minister's questions for Liz Truss, but also just the first Prime Minister's questions of this season. We'll go there in a few minutes' time. But interestingly, before I go back to you, Linda, just briefly, I mean, in a sense, Prime Minister Liz Truss is just taking all of Labour's policies. You know, when it comes to dealing with this crisis, yes, maybe going bigger, but essentially these are Labour's policies.
No, on the wholesale energy price freeze, if that's what is announced, that was actually something put forward by the industry itself, and they've been talking to government about that, and they laid it out themselves. Look, for me, the important thing is that we help those people that are most vulnerable with energy prices. That's what I was arguing for during the summer, and I'm very pleased we're going to see that package announced tomorrow.
Linda, one of the things that a lot of people are confused about is that the tax cuts that are also promised by Liz Truss and the combination of this huge amount of borrowing, how's it all going to lead to growth?
Yeah, well, I think that's where some of the tax cuts alone probably are not going to lead to growth. And I'm talking about corporation taxes. There's not a lot of evidence that makes a difference. It's actually some of the things that the previous Chancellor had announced, which is around how you structure incentives around, say, you know, R&D, how transparent your regulation is. Ultimately, those are the kinds of measures. I think what has been described as supply side, those are things that would generate growth. But I think the thing with taxes is because this energy crisis is so widespread, a lot of people who are not on universal, not on benefit wouldn't necessarily get direct help. I think that's probably where it sounds like that's the target, trying to get it out to more middle class families. But in terms of how markets will judge this, is that over the course of the Parliament, there does need to be a plan to show how the economy will benefit, will grow, because that's what ultimately makes the debt level sustainable.
All right.
So in other words, we always focus on the numerator, which is the debt level, but clearly the GDP, which is the denominator, that does need to grow. So when we see the announcements, we do need to see how these measures are structured to incentivize firms to hire, incentivize firms to invest. And investment is actually one of the biggest problems that we have. If we could get investment rates up, then growth rates would pick up.
Dr. Linda Yu, thank you very much. We will be discussing more of this, you'll be delighted to hear, after PMQs, because no doubt it will be a central part, well, I'm presuming, of Keir Starmer's questioning. A few minutes towards to, I should say, PMQs. Camilla, what about how Keir Starmer and Liz Truss are going to interact in terms of the approach?
The mind boggles.
Yes. How's it going to feel, do we think?
I mean, we think that Liz Truss isn't as slick a performer by her own admission as Boris Johnson, yet at the same time one gets the impression she might be better in PMQs because she's quite good reactively and spontaneously rather than in set pieces. So she might be better at the dispatch box than she is at the lectern outside Downing Street. She's certainly a different proposition. I would imagine, as we've heard today, the Labour shtick is going to be, well, you've had 12 years, why are you having to clear up your own mess? And the Tory shtick is going to be, well, where are your ideas? You haven't got any policies. And we're going to hear a lot of that. We're going to hear a lot of that, Harry.
How about Keir Starmer? Should there be a different approach? Does he continue as he did in terms of dealing with Boris Johnson?
Well, I presume that, it's a pretty target-rich environment, and I hope that he'll be able to hit a few bullseyes. We'll see.
Will there be an issue?
I suspect there'll be less bombast from
Johnson
this particular
Johnson was
Prime
flailing
Minister
for the last 6 months in most PMQs, and he'd just play his greatest hits, Ukraine and the rest.
Starmer couldn't land many blows. I mean, often there was an open goal and he was shooting it over the...
Well, I mean, it's always harder than it looks as someone who's done it. I like to think that I did land a few goals when I did it.
You should be on the front bench.
I mean, will there be an issue of, or a danger even, as Rishi Sunak was accused of mansplaining when it came to Liz Truss during the leadership contest? Will Keir Starmer have to watch that? that or sort of be mindful of it?
I think that's always a danger, absolutely. But I think Keir's style is very restrained, shall we say. You know, he doesn't score in open goals, and it's sort of, but it's also unobjectionable. I can't imagine he'll be tasked with the same criticism.
What about support? I mean, everybody, of course, on the Conservative benches, I presume, will be broadly supporting Liz Truss, even if they don't actually mean
Today,
it.
anyway.
Is it difficult? Is it going to be difficult, though, when, you know, not all of her MPs supported her?
Look, in PMQs, it's between us and the Labour Party. And in my view, and I think this is the view of all Conservative MPs, Conservative Prime Ministers are always better than Labour Prime Ministers. And I suspect every single Conservative MP...
Of course, I naturally think the opposite.
Every Conservative MP will be on her side and cheering her on.
Piece of news... let's go into the chamber.
You could have fooled us from watching how they've behaved.
With Paul Hamilton. Pauletta. Question number 1.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured to take my place as Prime Minister in this House and to take on responsibility at a vital time for our country. I am determined to deliver for everybody across our United Kingdom. I will work constructively with all members of this House to tackle the challenges we face. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the Prime Minister to her place? It's her first PMQ and it's also mine. In a leaked audio tape, the Prime Minister is heard saying that British workers need to put in more graft and that they are lacking in skill and application. She also wants to take away their basic workers' rights. In my Erdington constituency, the latest figures from the Commons Library show that children over 7,000 households are living in child poverty, and that 68% of those households have working parents. So does the Prime Minister believe that thousands of working parents on low income in my community should just put in more graft?
Well, I congratulate the Honourable Lady on her first Prime Minister's question. And what I am determined to do as Prime Minister is to make sure we have an economy with high wages and high-skilled jobs. And the way I will achieve that is through reducing taxes on people across our country and boosting economic growth. That is the way that we will make sure we get the investment and the jobs that people deserve.
I want to warmly congratulate my right honourable friend on becoming the third woman Prime Minister. And I want to ask her about pubs today. A pub restaurant in my constituency in Barnet got in touch with me to say they were struggling to find an energy supplier. And the quotes they had got hold of showed that they would be paying a 600% increase in their bill to £320,000. They can't survive that. Will she ensure her plan to tackle the energy price crisis helps businesses in the hospitality sector, which our communities value so much?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right. The hospitality industry is vital, and I will make sure in our energy plan that will help support businesses and people with the immediate price crisis, as well as making sure there are long-term supplies available, will help businesses as well as helping individual households.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on her appointment? When she said in her leadership campaign that she was against windfall taxes, did she mean it?
Very good question.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his welcome. I hope that we will be able to work together, particularly on areas we agree on. And I know that we have had strong support from the opposition in opposing Vladimir Putin's appalling war in Ukraine. And I want us to continue to stand up to that appalling Russian aggression that has led to the energy crisis we face now. I am against a windfall tax. I believe it is the wrong thing to be putting companies off investing in the United Kingdom just when we need to be growing the economy.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for that answer. I ask because the Treasury estimates are that the energy producers will make £170 billion in excess profits over the next 2 years. The Prime Minister knows she's no choice but to back an energy price freeze. But it won't be cheap, and the real choice, the political choice, is who is going to pay. Is she really telling us that she's going to leave these vast excess profits on the table and make working people foot the bill for decades to come?
Well, I understand that people across our country are struggling with the cost of living and they're struggling with their energy bills. And that is why I, as Prime Minister, will take immediate action to help people with the cost of their energy bills. And I will be making an announcement to this House on that tomorrow and giving people certainty to make sure that they are able to get through this winter and be able to have the energy supplies and be able to afford it. But we can't just deal with today's problem. We can't just put a sticking plaster on it. What we need to do is increase our energy supplies long term. And that is why we will open up more supply in the North Sea, which the honourable gentleman has opposed. That is why we will build more nuclear power stations, which the Labour Party didn't do when they were in office. And that is why we will get on with delivering the supply as well as helping people through the winter.
Well, I look forward to tomorrow's statement, but the money's got to come from somewhere. And she knows that every single pound in excess profits she chooses not to tax is an extra pound on borrowing that working people will be forced to pay back for decades to come. More borrowing than is needed. That's the true cost of her choice to protect oil and gas profits, isn't it?
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that this country will not be able to tax its way to growth. The way we will grow our economy is by attracting investment, keeping taxes low, delivering the reforms to build projects quicker. That is the way that we will create jobs and opportunities across our country.
So, Mr. Speaker, her first act as Prime Minister is to borrow more than is needed because she won't touch excess oil and gas profits. On that topic, how much would her planned corporation tax cut hand out to companies?
The right honourable gentleman is looking at this in the wrong way. The last time we cut corporation tax, we attracted more revenue into the exchequer because more companies wanted to base themselves in Britain, more companies wanted to invest in our country. And if taxes are put up and raised to the same level as France, which is what the current proposal is, and which I will change as Prime Minister, that will put off investors, it will put off those companies investing in our economy, and ultimately that will mean fewer jobs, less growth and less opportunities across our country.
Mr. Speaker, it's extraordinary that not only is the Prime Minister refusing to extend the windfall tax, she's also choosing to hand the water companies polluting our beaches a tax cut. She's choosing to hand the banks a tax cut. She's choosing to hand the banks a tax cut. Add it all together, and companies that are already doing well are getting a £17 billion tax cut, while working people pay for the cost of living crisis, stroke victims wait an hour for an ambulance, and criminals walk the streets with impunity. Families and public services need every penny they can get. How on earth does she think that now is the right time to protect Shell's profits and give Amazon a tax break?
I'm on the side of people who work hard and do the right thing. That is why we will reverse the national insurance increase, and that is why we will keep corporation tax low. Because ultimately, we want investment right across our country. We want new jobs and new opportunities. And that is what I will deliver as Prime Minister.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claims to be breaking orthodoxy. But the reality is she's reheating George Osborne's failed corporation tax plans, protecting oil and gas profits and forcing working people to pay the bill. She's the fourth Tory Prime Minister in 6 years. The face at the top may change, but the story remains the same. There is nothing new about the Tory fantasy of trickle-down economics. Nothing new about this Tory Prime Minister who nodded through every single decision that got us into this mess and now says how terrible it is. And can't she see there's nothing new about a Tory Prime Minister who, when asked who pays, says it's you, the working people of Britain?
Well, there's nothing new about a Labour leader who is calling for more tax rises. Tax and spend. What I'm about is about reducing taxes, getting our economy growing, getting investment, getting new jobs for people right across the country. I'm afraid to say the right honourable gentleman doesn't understand aspiration. He doesn't understand opportunity. He doesn't understand that people want to keep more of their own money. And that is what I will deliver as Prime Minister. I will take immediate action to help people with their energy bills, but also secure our long-term energy supply. I will take immediate action to make sure we have lower taxes and we grow the economy. And that way, I will ensure we have a positive future for our country and we get Britain moving.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And firstly, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for a successful campaign to become our party leader and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, it is right and proper that the government focuses its attention on rising energy costs for households across the country. But as we've heard, businesses big and small are exposed to horrific energy price increases, with no restraint provided by the domestic energy price cap and no support from government so far. For the sake of businesses in West Cornwall and on Scilly, the jobs they provide and the economy as a whole, what can my friend, the Right Honourable Prime Minister, do to ease the energy costs facing our businesses?
Well, my honourable friend is right. We do need to address the issues businesses face, and the package that we will be announcing tomorrow will do just that.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the thoughts and prayers of everyone in this House will be with the families that were caught up in the terrible shooting over recess in Kyle and McAlsh, and indeed in Liverpool as well. And we trust that the families will be fully supported. Mr. Speaker, let me congratulate the Prime Minister and her family on her appointment. But I'm sorry to say that her reputation for straight talking has fallen apart at the first PMQs. After 9 questions, she's still not told us who will pay for her energy plan. Prime Minister, today the public are waiting to find out the response to the economic crisis, and they want answers. So, will the Prime Minister finally answer 2 very simple questions? Will she freeze energy prices at their current levels? And will it be paid for by a windfall tax? Yes or no?
Well, no, it won't be paid for by a windfall tax. I don't believe we can tax our way to growth. And what I want to see is us using more of our UK energy supply, including more oil and gas from the North Sea and nuclear power in Scotland as well. And I hope I can count on the SNP's support for that.
Here, Blackford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that on her first full day as Prime Minister, she has failed to rule out.
Shh. Let's hear the next question. Ian Blackford.
The Prime Minister may have changed, Mr. Speaker, but it's the same old being shouted down by the Tories. On her first full day as Prime Minister, she's failed to rule out a trust tax on households and businesses, instead of targeting the profits of massive corporations with a windfall tax. The Prime Minister's plan appears to be a decade-long raid on the bank accounts of ordinary taxpayers. These costs must not be passed on to consumers and businesses by deferring bills. Government must announce an enhanced windfall profits tax, making sure that those oil and gas producers pay their fair share from excess profits. Does the Prime Minister understand that her first act as Prime Minister will now define her? A trust tax that households and businesses will be paying for years to come.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the Right Honourable Gentleman's position is, because on one hand, he doesn't seem to want oil and gas extraction from the North Sea, and on the other hand, he wants them to pay more taxes. Why does he make up his mind?
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also warmly welcome my right honourable friend to her seat as Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Scottish Power, Bulb and E.ON, just three of many energy suppliers that say they provide 100% renewable electricity. Yet constituents of mine in West Dorset are baffled that the energy regulator allows those prices to rise on par with oil and gas. Would my right honourable friend confirm that she is on the side of the consumer in her energy policy that we'll hear from tomorrow?
Well, I certainly am on the side of consumer, and we need to make sure that we deal with all of the issues in the energy market and the way that energy is regulated. And I will certainly be saying more about this tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister should know by now that many people in the north of Ireland are starving and freezing in their homes. We need a tailored solution for Northern Ireland, but that's much harder to achieve because the DUP are refusing to form a government at Stormont. The new Prime Minister has a choice to make. She can either be on the side of the DUP or on the side of struggling people in Northern Ireland. So whose side is she on?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to work with all of the parties in Northern Ireland to get the Executive and the Assembly back up and running so we can collectively deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. But in order to do that, we do need to fix the issues of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has damaged the balance between the communities in Northern Ireland. I'm determined to get on with doing that, and I'm determined to work with all parties to find that resolution.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate my right honourable friend and welcome her to her position as the third female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Can I ask my right honourable friend, why does she think it is that all three female Prime Ministers have been Conservative?
I thank my right honourable friend for her fantastic question. I look forward to calling on her advice from her time in office as I start my work as Prime Minister. It is quite extraordinary, isn't it, that there doesn't seem to be the ability in the Labour Party to find a female leader, or indeed a leader who doesn't come from North London. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the issue is.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also congratulate the Prime Minister on her appointment? Mr. Speaker, inflation is at a 40-year high. The NHS is on its knees with 6.6 million people waiting for treatment. Thousands of victims of sexual offences and violent crime are waiting for justice, not to mention passport delays, a summer of chaos in our airports and our beaches covered in sewage. The Prime Minister has served in every one of the Conservative governments responsible for this mess. So why should the British public trust her to clean up the mess that she's helped create?
I'm determined that we deal with the issues facing us as a nation. We do have problems with our energy supply due to the appalling war being perpetrated by Putin in Ukraine. That is why I will take immediate action to deal with the energy crisis. My Chancellor will take immediate action to reduce taxes and make sure we are growing our economy. And our new Health Secretary, who is also the Deputy Prime Minister, will be taking immediate action to make sure people are able to get appointments with their GP and proper NHS services.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
All sides of the House should wish to help the Prime Minister be successful in tackling the problems facing the country. When I raised one of them with the former Prime Minister in July, he said I could talk to the Housing Minister, but the Housing Minister retired after 17 minutes of hearing that. Can I ask the Prime Minister to look to see why the Planning Inspectorate are able to overturn Council's planned protections for green lungs, and will she look at what's happening to the Goring Gap, the A259 in Worthing West and in South Downs constituency, because local councils have no role if they can't protect what matters most to them.
Well, I am a bit concerned about offering the honourable gentleman a meeting with the Housing Minister in case any ill should befall him. But look, my honourable friend is right. There is not enough power in local hands at the moment. It is too easy for local councils to be overruled by the Planning Inspectorate, and that is certainly an issue that I'm expecting my Secretary of State for Housing to look at.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. According to the Prime Minister's new Deputy Prime Minister, one of the things that qualified her most for being PM and was one of her greatest achievements was the reintroduction of beavers. Now, I'm all for the beavers, but given her flip-flopping on Brexit and given her inability to understand global affairs, how can constituents like mine, like Waz Abbas, whose energy prices are going to go from £7,000 to £37,000 a year, or Broadtext in Livingston, who are going to go from £50,000 to £250,000 a month, have any faith that she can tackle the oncoming humanitarian crisis? Is she going to come out of her den in number 10 and take real action, or is she going to be as useless and corrupt as her predecessor, who's rocketed off to somewhere in the Pacific?
Well, I am determined to tackle the issues we face in energy, and I look forward to the Scottish Government playing their part by building new nuclear power stations.
Can I just say, I want a nice apology. That was not a good example. I certainly don't want the use corrupt being used against the new Prime Minister. And I'm sure the honourable member, I'm sure the honourable member will withdraw it. Just withdraw the comment.
Sometimes the truth hurts, but I'm happy to withdraw it.
Pretty sure. Right. Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I warmly congratulate my right honourable friend. May I welcome her to her place. But may I also wish her the very best in the heavy responsibilities she now bears. Around 1.5 million households across the countryside rely on heating oil in order to keep their homes warm and to cook their meals. They have faced price rises of around 130% in recent months, and they are not part of the energy price cap. As rumours abound about what tomorrow's statement may hold, will my right honourable friend confirm that those 1.5 million households, many of them in rural areas such as my own constituency, will be specifically included in any mooted ideas about an energy price freeze?
Well, my honourable friend is right, and many of my constituents too rely on heating oil for their fuel, and we need to make sure that we are looking after everybody in this very, very difficult winter that we're facing.
Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Members may be familiar with the work of Bowness firm Ballantyne's Castings, an iron foundry in operation since the 1820s, which in recent years has done much work around the parliamentary estate. Without the protection of an energy price cap, this specialist SME is witnessing unaffordable costs, with bills rising from £13,000 to £120,000 per month. Heavy energy users face a disproportionate burden and clearly need more support than other businesses. What will the PM do to protect our strategically important and energy-intensive industries?
Well, I very strongly agree with the honourable gentleman that there are strategic industries that we need to make sure who use a lot of energy. We need to do all we can to help them become more energy efficient, but we also need to make sure that they're able to remain competitive in the global marketplace, and that is certainly something the Energy Secretary is looking at in preparing this package.
Dr. Kieran Mullins.
I congratulate the Prime Minister on her appointment and tell her I know my constituents wanted to succeed at a difficult time. Outside of the immediate challenges of energy and inflation, levelling up remains a priority for them. One way to demonstrate her commitment to levelling up would be to choose a town like Crewe to host Great British Railways. Can she ensure that levelling up is at the heart of that decision?
Well, Crewe is, of course, a great railway town. My honourable friend is absolutely right. I'm not going to prejudge the decision that will be made, but what I will be doing as Prime Minister is absolutely focusing on levelling up and making sure we're attracting the investment and growth into parts of this country that have been left behind, so they have their fair share of opportunity.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Mr Speaker, the new Prime Minister is now finally in post. But make no mistake, she does not have the support of the British public. She can't even rely on the backing of her own MPs. And people in Pontypridd will never forget that she played a key role in a government that failed millions. So will she now finally do the right and decent thing and call a general election?
Mr Speaker, as a country, we are facing a very serious crisis in energy caused by Putin's war in Ukraine. We are facing...
Order. One of the members for Stoke is getting very carried away. And I know as a former teacher he wants to show better behaviour than he's showing at the moment. Come on, Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we are facing very serious issues as a country, partly as a result of the aftermath of COVID, partly as a result of Putin's war in Ukraine. What the British people want is they want a government that's going to sort it out. And that is what I'm determined to do as Prime Minister, sort out the energy crisis, get our economy going, make sure people can get doctor's appointments. That's what I'm focused on.
Nick Fletcher.
Mr Speaker, I would like to congratulate my honourable friend for the position as Prime Minister, but I'd also like to thank her for the support of my campaign to keep Doncaster Sheffield Airport open. Would she now help further right into South Yorkshire Mayor Oliver Coppard and Peel Holdings Chairman John Whittaker to remind them of their powers, duties and responsibilities to the people of South Yorkshire and beyond? And will she use the full weight of her office on these decision makers so as to keep our Doncaster Sheffield Airport open?
Well, regional airports, including the Doncaster Sheffield Airport, are a vital part of our economic growth. And what I will make sure is that the new Transport Secretary is immediately onto this issue. I know she is, I can tell. Look, she's already contacting the people in Doncaster and Sheffield to make sure we do protect this airport and we protect that vital infrastructure and connectivity that helps our economy grow.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'd also like to welcome the Prime Minister to her new post. During her leadership campaign, she said that waiting times for ambulances in her rural Norfolk constituency were appalling. And in North Shropshire, I think many of my constituents would agree with that statement. Across Britain, waiting hours and hours for an ambulance has become normal. But instead of focusing on this problem, a leadership fiasco in the Conservatives have seen 3 health secretaries in 3 months. Will the Prime Minister get a grip on this grave situation and commission the CQC into investigating the causes of and the solutions to the ambulance services delays before the service in crisis faces the additional pressures of an oncoming winter?
People should not have to wait as long as they are for ambulance services, and my new Health Secretary is immediately tackling this issue. She's already laid out her priorities, and sorting out the ambulance service is one of them.
Dame Caroline Downage.
Speaker, can I also very warmly welcome our new Prime Minister to her role and indeed the whole of her front bench. September is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month, and as she knows, cancer is still the biggest killer of children under the age of 14. So I wonder if she could restate her government's commitment to publish a cancer 10-year strategy, but also embedding a childhood cancer mission at its very heart.
Well, Mr. Speaker, cancer is a devastating disease, and it's particularly heartbreaking when children have cancer, and certainly we will proceed with the strategy that she talks about, and I know our new Health Secretary will do all she can to help those children with cancer.
Sir Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the theme of children, she will know from her time as Children's Minister that young lungs exposed to cold and damp housing are more likely to fall seriously ill and possibly die. Now, child poverty has been growing during her ministerial time in different offices. Will she give a solemn pledge and no evasion that there will be no child that will go to bed in a cold, damp house this winter and beyond because the parents cannot afford to put the heating on?
Yeah. But this is why it's so important that we do tackle the issue of energy, and I will make sure that people are able to afford their energy bills at the same time as dealing with the long-term supply issues to make sure that we are resilient in energy and never get into this position again.
Mr. Speaker, it is the standard practice of the European Union that when they can't get their way in negotiations with the UK, they play for time and wait for a new leader who they hope will have a different view to their predecessor. For the sake of clarity, would my right honourable friend confirm that it is the UK's preferred option to have a negotiated settlement as far as the Northern Ireland Protocol is concerned? But if that is not forthcoming, then we will proceed with the protocol bill that is currently going through Parliament.
Well, first of all, can I thank my right honourable friend for his service as Northern Ireland Secretary. He is absolutely right. We need to resolve the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol. My preference is for a negotiated solution, but it does have to deliver all of the things we set out in the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. And what we cannot allow is for this situation to drift, because my #1 priority is protecting the supremacy of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement.
Rachel Hopkins.
Speaker, the new Prime Minister tells us she will deliver on the NHS. Well, that's a turn up for the books, because after 12 years of Conservatives driving our NHS into the ground, we have record waiting lists, people dying in ambulances outside A&E, and nurses using food banks. Yeah. So given the Prime Minister has served in the past 3 Conservative governments on that watch, can she explain why we should trust her to deliver?
I mean, I don't agree with the way she is talking down our National Health Service. The fact is that our health service did brilliantly in tackling COVID, in delivering the vaccine rollout, and in getting this country back on its feet. But we do face challenges now with the backlog following COVID. And this is why the new Health Secretary is going to work to address those challenges.
Jeremy Wright.
Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend on her appointment and recognise her determination to address the many urgent and difficult challenges that face us now. But would she accept that one of those challenges is an almost entirely unregulated online space? And would she accept, too, that no responsible government can avoid the need for excellent, balanced, sensible regulation in this space? And would she therefore assure me that the online safety bill will come back to this House swiftly for us to consider further and amend if necessary?
Well, I can assure my honourable friend that we will be proceeding with the online safety bill. There are some issues that we need to deal with. What I want to make sure is that we protect the under-18s from harm, but we also make sure free speech is allowed. So there may be some tweaks required, but certainly he is right that we need to protect people's safety online.
Ella Days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been part of a government for the past 12 years, which has been systematically letting down the most vulnerable children in the country. The independent review of children's social care, published by the government in May, describes the system as in need of a total reset. The Prime Minister has said she wants to deliver. Will she make a cast-iron commitment to deliver for our country's most vulnerable children and publish the government's response to the independent review and an action plan for delivery before the end of the year? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to congratulate my right honourable friend and her whole front bench and wish them every success in the new government. I'd particularly like to thank my right honourable friend for her steadfast commitment to support for the earliest years throughout the 12 years that she and I have worked together for 3 previous Prime Ministers. So can I ask her now to renew her commitment to rolling out the Best Start for Life to give every baby the best chance at leading a fulfilling life?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend has done such a fantastic job championing this issue, developing the policies, and I am committed to following through and delivering for children, because what we know is intervening early, helping children early is the best way to help those children have a successful childhood and ultimately a fulfilled life.
That ends PMQ'S.
Well, that was a very abrupt end to Prime Minister's questions. Caught us all a little by surprise, including, I should think, MPs. But that is the end of Liz Truss, Prime Minister Liz Truss, her first Prime Minister's questions with Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. Let's welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Ian Duncan-Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party, who supported Liz Truss in her campaign. Emily Thornberry, Shadow Attorney General for the Labour Party. And Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. Welcome to all of you. The first thing to say is that Liz Truss herself announced pretty well at the beginning of PMQs that she will give the statement tomorrow in Parliament on the government's plan to freeze energy bills. So we will be put out of our misery in terms of that. But let's talk about the dynamic between Liz Truss, how did she do, Vicky, and Keir Starmer in terms of how he responded to her.
Well, it's always a moment, isn't there, where there's a new face in one of those roles, and Keir Starmer now is the old hand, you know, facing her. Now, look, I think even, you know, Liz Truss's closest friends would say she's not the best performer when it comes to making speeches or being on the media. She's actually a bit more comfortable at the dispatch box, I would say. I think she started off pretty nervous, but she did get into her stride. She kept it pretty simple, as did he. And I think what was interesting is it got right to the heart of this matter, the whole issue.
It was a policy, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was very much about policy.
Crisis,
yes.
She, against her instincts, has realised she's going to have to do a huge state intervention to help people. So that is very clear that it's going to be big. They want this, in a way, to stop being an issue. Because actually, if the government somehow matches what Labour has said, you know, that then deals with this for quite a long time. So what Keir Starmer has done, knowing that, has got to the heart of who pays and trying to draw that dividing line between what he says Labour would do and what he says the government would do. He's saying she's letting these big companies get away with huge profits and putting the burden on the working person. And that is the fundamental argument we're going to hear now over the next few months, with Liz Truss making the case for tax cuts and growing the economy. And of course, everyone then saying, well, how do you make that happen?
Right. Well, let's just stick with the Commons moment. Ian, let's take you back to when You stood at the dispatch box as leader of the Conservative Party. In opposition. I was in opposition. It was quite different. But what did you make of her first outing as Prime Minister there?
Well, first of all, there's a distinct difference now between what was before with Boris and with her. Hers is a much more focused, business-like way of doing it. She actually answered the questions directly, so you couldn't be accused of running around the questions. She certainly did, which is why Vicky's right. We end up in a very clear dispute on a particular area of territory. I thought she looked pretty confident, really, in her own way. That's how she works. And I thought, therefore, it was a good performance. And it was a good performance because I think, if I look at Keir Starmer, and I've had to do that job, it's not the easiest job in the world to be leader of the opposition because you ask a question and you have to assume you know how they're going to answer it to follow it on and follow it on. So you have to be quite light on your feet. But I think he will, for a while, struggle to get the right way of dealing with her because he's been used to dealing with Boris Johnson. So with Boris Johnson, it was all big booster stuff, lots of loud voices and men shouting at each other. Now, all of a sudden, there's a woman on the other side, and it's becoming much more direct. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic changes in pure theatre, as it were. But I think today, I think he was really very cautious about how he dealt with it. They got to the right arguments in the end, but there was no kind of slanging match going on, really.
I mean, do you think that's right, Emily? Do you think Keir Starmer was treading quite carefully because it is the first time he's faced Liz Truss across the dispatch box as Prime Minister?
I think each time you get, you have to ask questions of a new person, you have to reset. So although he's got experience of asking questions at Prime Minister's questions, to get somebody new in is quite different. I mean, I've been against Boris Johnson, I've been against Liz Truss. It seems everybody that I shadow ends up being Prime Minister. Suella Braverman is next. But I've also done Prime Minister's questions on behalf of the opposition. And I think one of the things which struck me was that you didn't get, and people don't realise this, because on television you don't get, the mics don't pick up everything, that I don't think there wasn't the kind of wall of noise. But, you know, to do that for the first time. So, you know, so she's done departmental questions and where there's a relatively small number of people. She's done, I think, Northern Ireland Protocol, which may have had 150 people in the chamber. But to go in and for there suddenly to be, you know, 350 people shouting at you can be, that wall of noise can be very intimidating. And I think, you know, we both had it. But I don't think it necessarily happened today, which was kind of interesting.
Yes.
And will have made things, you know, I think obviously it's better, but and it would have made things easier for her. I think what she did was that she'd obviously done a lot of prep for it and she had a number of sort of relatively short scripted answers that she gave to everybody, including kind of relatively friendly questions. So I think that, you know, it was a kind of, it was a sort of cautious day out for all sides. And we'll see how it goes.
All right, let's get to the substance, since that is what they talked about and clashed over. So we think we know the broad plan. It's an enormous amount of borrowing, perhaps costing up to £150 billion. The question is how it is going to be paid for. Why won't the government, why won't Liz Truss accept that another tax, a windfall tax, on the excess profits of oil and gas producers is the right thing to do?
Are you talking to me? Yeah. OK. Well, first of all, she's right in this regard, because if you look at you've got to remember the government already has gone a windfall tax on the first 15 billion that they put out in May. That was based on a windfall tax. They're meant to be getting 5 billion off the oil companies, the oil and gas companies. The problem is they won't get that 5 billion. They'll be lucky if they get about $1 billion off it. I was looking at some forecasts the other day, and the reason for that is that these are global companies. And the more you try and nail them down on a single tax, the more they start shifting their tax base. Now, whether you like it or not, that's a fact of life. So first of all, it's a political process, an argument about whether you should tax those who are making profits. The question is,
excess profits of £170 billion.
But, you know, when they make losses, do you intervene with them? No, you don't. So the key balance here is, what do you need on balance? First of all, what is important to the public, I think, is will the government step in and make sure that they don't have the frightening prospect of being unable to heat their homes during the winter. This is the number one thing that certainly my constituents talk about. They don't get involved in how you're going to do that. That's a government matter. So the debate, though, between the two sides is whether or not you think that the more you try and hit people who run businesses with taxes, the more likely they are no longer to invest and to pull that investment somewhere else. So this is a balance about the future in terms of growth versus whether or not you take a knee-jerk reaction and try and say, this this is a good political gesture, but it just won't get the money that you think it gets. This is
Emily,
likely to be a package of 90, 100 billion, and you'll be lucky if you get much money off them.
I mean, that is true, that even Labour's own figures are talking about £8.1 billion in terms of what a windfall tax will raise. That is a drop in the ocean compared to 100 and 150 billion pounds. They are already taxed. Do you accept the points that Ian Duncan-Smith is saying in terms of them being able to move tax base, that it may work politically for a bit, but no more?
I think this is a question of whose side are you on. I think we begin with everybody agreeing that we cannot allow people to face the sort of increase in... So that's kind of non-debatable. So it really is a question of who is going to pay for it, right? And given that the prices are going up so much, and given that the oil companies are going to make so much profit out of oil taken out of the seas around Britain, right? So they're British-based companies. It's going to be very difficult for them to wriggle out of this. And given the amount of the billions and billions, 17 billion profit that they're going to be making, then yes, why should they make that excess profit at this time? And why is a former Shell executive, that is our new Prime Minister, giving all this money to Shell and all the other companies and just going, oh, don't worry about it, you know, we're going to keep the price low, but you can have all this public money. And then the question is, once we've given the oil companies all this public money, you know, who is going to have to pay for all that borrowing? It's going to be ordinary working people. And at a time like this, every single pound should count.
Is it fair? I mean, that's what people will ask. They may not mind at the moment. None of us may mind if we're going to get this huge package about how it's paid for. But
everybody's going to be so relieved at the moment. And what they need to do is look beyond that.
But is that what the government's actually banking on? Are you uncomfortable, Ian, bearing in mind your philosophy and your ideology, that the government that you're supporting is going to be borrowing up to £150 billion?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Centre for Social Justice, which I set up and run, put a package out the other day about how you target also the poorest in society. And I think that's something I want to look for in any package. Are we actually going to be
worried it's not targeted?
Well, I will want to see that we do actually see an element of targeting, because they're the ones that are going to suffer the most, and they will need more than anybody else for that reason.
That's why we've said that what we should be doing is keeping the part of Rishi Sunak's policy, but just have that targeted at those on benefits and pensioners and those who are suffering from disabilities, which you can do easily because you can identify those people. So give that Rishi Sunak money, you know, to that group, but then ensure that everybody gets a cut, you know, to their so they get their £400 as well as cut, you know, making sure that the prices don't.
But there is a problem. I looked at the plan that you guys brought forward. Fine. The problem is you can't now stop that process. So first of all, the 15 billion is rolling out. You can't suddenly reverse that. The IFS made that very clear the other day. It's simply not going to happen. To try and then retarget at that point would be wrong. I would have liked to see more targets. Well, I'd like to see more targets. Yeah, the CSJ has written a very good paper. It's worth reading.
And the whole of the summer they didn't do anything.
But notwithstanding that, the key thing here is, do you want to have a political argument or do you actually want to do the right thing? And the right thing right now is to get this done so that people lose the fear of the winter, which is critical. People in damp homes, etc. So we do that. The question of how you pay for it is ultimately always going to be massively on the shoulders of the government.
Right.
And the key issue is about how much of that will be financed through borrowing. All right. How much, therefore, will you be able to reduce the borrowing requirement right now? And do we already have a very heavy borrowing? It's worth looking at the fact that the UK, proportionate to GDP, has one of the lowest borrowing.
All right, but we've had a discussion about who will pay ultimately. I mean, Emily, is there another problem for Labour, which is that actually Liz Truss has stolen, broadly speaking, your policy of an energy price freeze, but she is doing it on steroids, if you like. I mean, it's just much, much bigger, comprehensive, and it will go on for longer, because Labour's plan was to freeze bills, but just for 6 months. Just at the point, actually, if I just show everybody this graph here, average annual energy bills, it would have taken us to April next year, which is the peak, as predicted by Ofgem, of energy bills at a whopping £6,616 for the average household bill.
So the reality is this, right? We were trying to make it clear that there was an alternative to just like nothing, which is what the government was doing for the whole of the summer, and say, look, here are some ideas you can freeze. We were only going to do it for 6 months on the statistics that we had, on the numbers that we had, and because obviously we knew the numbers would change and we would need to then come out with another plan thereafter. I think you kind of are hitting the nail on the head when you suggest that what they're trying to do, what this government is trying to do, is very early on bounce us into a situation whereby they can freeze energy for, is it 18 months they say they're going to do?
Which will
and
pretty well take to the next election.
Everybody will be so relieved that they will overlook the fact that.
But you think it's the right thing to do?
Oh no! Look, it's a question of how it's paid
another
for.
Bit here, which
wait a minute. It's a question of how it's paid for, and what they're hoping is that nobody will notice that actually what we're being asked to do is for ordinary people to be paying for it for 20 years.
Well, there's an interesting dynamic here. You've got Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, standing up in the House of Commons talking to Liz Truss, who has got a reputation for being very much of the right of the party ideologically, wouldn't want to be borrowing, would want everything to be funded, and he is talking really about being prudent. That's what's happening. So this is the dynamic he's trying to paint here, is that Labour is actually being more careful about how this kind of thing
it's our money.
Is
our
funded.
money. It's got to be spent
This is interesting,
properly.
isn't it?
There is one difference between these two packages, apart from scale and time and everything else. It's that when Labour put forward their package, it didn't actually affect business. Bear in mind, business was not capped, so they've had to suffer the bigger, higher prices. What I hope and believe the government will do now is recognise you have to cover businesses as well, particularly small business.
Well, and some of them are going to the wall already.
Which is why the cost will be greater.
Right.
Because it's going to cover, everybody's going to be hit, and the small businesses are the ones that you really need.
Well, let me just pick up on something that Vicky has just said in terms of a bit of political cross-dressing when it's come to the sort of questions and answers, because in contrast to Liz Truss, recent other Conservative Prime Ministers haven't always been so relaxed about borrowing. Let's take a look at this from the 2015 election campaign.
I became Prime Minister at a time when there was no money left. And I bring this with me everywhere, the note that the Treasury Minister left. And there it is. Dear Chief Secretary, I'm afraid there is no money. Do we go right back to the start with Ed Miliband potentially propped up by the SNP, who want even more borrowing, even more spending, even more debt, all the things that landed us in that mess in the first place? I never want us to go back there again.
What's changed, Ian? Do you not care about borrowing anymore?
Let's get this in perspective. 2019, early 2020, we are hit by the single biggest event that has hit any government since the Second World War. The COVID crisis, the lockdown, all industry was shut down. Reopening it has been difficult. Demand has outstripped supply globally. It's not just in the UK. You are looking across Europe, into the USA. Germany's about to head into recession. France is about to follow. Italy is now screaming that they don't want to follow on the sanctions with Russia any longer. There's real problems. That has led to this next phase of the crisis, which is high inflation. Now we've got the war in Ukraine. That's led to problems with energy. So the truth is, for the last 3-4 years, a government has faced probably the single set of biggest crises that anyone does. So that's absolutely fine if you're dealing with that particular
but there'll be a lot of people, Ian, who will say, I don't remember David Cameron and George Osborne making the same sort of concessions at the global financial crash, which they obviously always blamed Labour directly for. But on that, Wes Streeting, your colleague, was in that chair earlier in the week and said that Labour is judged by different standards when it comes to tax and spend and issues of borrowing. Do you agree with that? Is Labour just being too cautious, would like to go further but feels it can't?
I think that what people need to know from the opposition is that we are a government that they can put their trust in. And I think that the Conservatives do spend a huge amount of time trying to label us as being profligate. And it's simply not true. And, we appreciate that the money that is spent is not just the government's, but belongs to individuals, and every single penny must count. And so we do not put forward any policies in opposition that cannot be seen to be, we say not only this is what we're going to do, but this is how it's going to be paid for. And, and we are doing our utmost to show that people can trust us, they can put their trust in us, and that hopefully in 2 years' time, we will be a government that people can be, thank goodness, a sensible, proper government that understands it's our money they're spending.
Ian?
Yeah, well, it's always the battle at the end of the day is always who do you trust? I mean, there's no question about that. I think governments... I'm not sure I agree with Wes Streeting. I think governments are all judged on much the same criteria, which is, do you believe what they're saying to you? Have they a record of being able to deliver reasonable politics and a good economy? I think both sides will be judged on that. I think the point I was trying to make earlier is that we are in a very peculiar period because there has never been a time like this where we've had one major crisis which has required borrowing on a scale which is, frankly, sort of off the Richter scale, as it were, and then followed by another crisis as a result of that, which is yet again now leading to an inflation crisis. Now, the point I'm making is simply that has shifted the dial. We now have to deal with that to get ourselves back into the normal waters of politics, which are about how much you spend, where you get the money from, and how that is.
And how much more you're going to borrow, which is why, when you have a chance to have a windfall tax, instead of increasing borrowing the amount that this trust wants to, just because she's had this soundbite about being against windfall taxes,
but that's a political
we are
game.
now finding ourselves.
That's a political game. You don't get the money.
Well, hang on. Well, it's all politics.
Yeah. What to say here is this is a political choice, and if what Keir Starmer's trying to do is portray Liz Truss as somebody who is not on the side of the working person,
but
that
that's
she's
what he will always
turning
do.
away from, big profits, big companies, and national insurance.
Earlier on in the programme, we were talking about the potential danger of having so many former ministers and former prime ministers and leaders of the party on the backbenches. Well, Theresa May stood up and asked a very pointed question, congratulating Liz Truss on being the third female Conservative prime minister, and why it was that the Conservatives have managed to do that and Labour not. Is that becoming a bit of an issue now?
Yeah, well, I suppose it helps if you change your leader every 2 years.
You'll get one eventually.
Which we don't do.
Much earlier.
Which we don't do. And,
You've had quite a few changes of leader, and still you, one of your female colleagues, has not been leader.
No, but, we do have a really good leader and we're hoping that he will be the next Prime Minister. I think what's important is that we get a Labour Prime Minister into Parliament. And, of course, remember that half of the Shadow Cabinet are women in very important positions. And I can tell you this, I'm sure it won't come as a surprise, none of the women he's got around the table are exactly backwards in coming forwards.
No.
Yeah, well, I think, one day I hope Labour will have a woman leader that comes forward. I mean, it's important because, half the population are women. They need to have a sense that you can get on. Politics has been difficult for women for a long, long time. I think it's getting better now. But also, just look at the front bench today on the new front bench, the Conservative side. It's more than just a female leader. We have people very racially diverse sitting in all the top jobs.
And behind them, you see row upon row. I'm sorry, but you do. You see behind the Tory front bench, you see row upon row of people who look very similar. A middle-aged white men in dark suits.
Well, there's a lot more women in the Conservative Party. A lot more people from ethnic backgrounds. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to have a front bench.
The truth is, let's just be completely straightforward about this.
All right.
More than half of the women, more than half of the MPs on the Labour side are women.
All right. In terms of jobs, Ian, did you turn down a job in the Cabinet?
I did.
As Leader of the House of Commons?
I discussed which job it was, but I wasn't in a bidding war. I said no. I thought I was likely to do
You turned down a job in the Cabinet? Why?
Yeah, well, I've been in Cabinet. I've, run a big department and everything else. And what I want to know is, do I add value more on the inside or on the outside? And what I want to be able to do is still be critical, to be able to focus on the things that I think are necessary, and to be able to say the things that I want to say.
Well, I already mentioned about more targeted help. We've had Mark Harper also saying, to some extent, that we're holding Liz Truss's feet to the fire. Let's see, obviously, a Rishi Sunak supporter. You would rather do something like be chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee?
Well, I'm interested in it. I haven't made a declaration, but I'd like to come and do that. But I also set up the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. I'm very concerned about the threat there. We've got 26 countries involved. We have co-chairs on the left and right of every country. We're meeting in Washington next week. There's going to be 60 of us from different parliaments all over the world. So this is important. I'm also chairman of the Centre for Social Justice. There's a lot I want to do. And
well, it's about
you just take a balanced decision, really.
It's about influence, isn't it? I mean, Emily, do you think, as a former Shadow Foreign Secretary, do you think Ian Duncan-Smith would be good as chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee?
That's a bit unfair.
I don't think he wants my endorsement.
But in terms of influence, do you think you have more influence on the backbenches?
Well, it's just what you want to do. If you just want to sit around, that's fine. And if you want to be in Cabinet, I don't, people want to be there. It's a huge
quite crowded
huge
with lots of people on the backbenches offering advice, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But my general view is nothing about it. I want the government to succeed, but I also want to be able to continue to do the things that I do. And I'm interested in a whole range of things. So.
All right, well, that's all we have time for. Of course, we will be back tomorrow. More Politics Live at 12:15 on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. But thank you very much to all of my guests for today. For the first Prime Minister's Questions for Liz Truss. Thank you.
Interesting. Interesting. Who's going to pay? I'm guessing that's the theme. Who's going to pay? Taxpayer or big oil companies? Taxpayer. I mean, I'll agree with Ian Duncan Smith though. There's no way you're getting fucking money out of these scrupulous cunts anyway. I mean, you can, but it won't be like the billions. Not all of it. I just fucking nationalise the fuck out of them anyway, I suppose. Anyway, see you tomorrow.